I invite you to pray with me. God, even the tiniest sparrow holds your deepest concern. Even a lily in the valley that neither toils nor reaps is your most precious creation. And so we ask that your word, which carries all of the power in the world, would be close to us, just as you are, so that we might know the specialness of your care and apply it in each place you may call us to go. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of every heart here and every heart that joins us in the spirit of worship today be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Do you have a sort of in-the-gut vision of what heaven looks like? Like the first time, anytime someone brings up the name heaven, do you have a sense of what it might look like? Do you have a vision of it? Even if you don't mean for it to be this vision, do you have it there? Because I know that when I was a child, I wound up with my vision of what heaven might be. And it involved clouds and maybe a mansion or several, I'm not quite sure. So it's somewhat biblical. In my Father's house, there are many mansions or dwelling places. And on this cloud, I sort of imagine myself reclining at my most ideal weight, my most beautiful years recaptured in the heavenly realm. And there I am, just sort of reclining and waiting for some bunch of grapes that are just dewy and coming, and I just take a bite every time I get hungry and I'm fully satiated. This is my vision, my accidental vision of heaven. Anyone else have one sort of like that? Yeah, right, yeah. Who else has a vision of heaven? What does your vision of heaven look like? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So there's a bunch of clouds and everything you've ever loved is there. There's a wonderful cartoon. I don't know where it appeared. Maybe it was in the New Yorker, where I think it was actually. And there's a picture of this dog sort of bounding across the clouds, and there's a picture of God, and or maybe it was an angel or anyone. But so the guy gets to the clouds, and the dog is super excited, and the angel says, "Oh, here you are. Rover's been talking about you for so many years." Yeah, I think that's a beautiful vision of heaven. And I'm not contradicting it because guess what? I'm not exactly the expert. And anyone who tells you that they know exactly what heaven looks like is probably trying to sell you something. Who's been? Now, that may be your vision of heaven or something that looks very sort of relaxed, right? I'm not sure if that's the vision Jesus gives us. And this reminds me of my friend, Mary Sue Brookshire. Mary Sue is the kind of woman who, let's say something happens to her washing machine. It would break her heart to call a repair person. And instead, what she will do is take that bad boy apart, not the repair person, but the machine. And she would take it all out and lay all the parts out on the floor and then figure out what was wrong and put it back together. And in most cases, she will have the issue fixed. Now, Mary Sue, also who lives in San Diego, has this beautiful grove of citrus trees in her backyard. And there are 3 different kinds. She has Valencia oranges, Meyer lemons, and tangerines. And it's beautiful in San Diego because all year round, the trees are preparing for the winter harvest when you can pluck your beautiful fruit from the tree. But the thing about citrus trees is that they're actually kind of a lot of work. And what Mary Sue is well suited to is that she's ready for it. And at the end of the harvest, what you can always sort of count on is that if you run into Mary Sue, she'll have a bushel of fruit ready for you that she'll just give you because she's plucked it. But some of us are not really cut out for citrus trees, and Mary Sue will step in for you. So one time, I saw her, and she had her arm just bandaged up from I didn't know what, and of course a terrible friend like me then made fun of her for it. But what had happened was that it was the end of the season, and she had to go ahead and get all that fruit down before it fell and rotted on her ground. And so she spent all day doing this back-breaking work of reaching up into these trees, and this, as you can imagine, is not exactly an ergonomic position. And so at the end of her harvest time, she was all a mess. And of course, I made fun of her for it. So as you can imagine, in my vision of the kingdom of heaven, I'm not imagining that kind of labor. Right now, in this time of agricultural harvest, farmers across the United States are having a hard time finding the laborers to do the work, thanks to our new immigration policy enforcement. It gets to be a little difficult to find the people who are willing to do this back-breaking work, willing or forced to by life circumstances. It's hard to get those folks to do it when they can't cross the border without a dog coming after them or a machine gun. It's hard to do if there aren't coyotes, what they call the people who help folks cross the border, these laborers who once called these very lands of farms their own homes once upon a time. New Mexico, guess what? That used to be Mexico. California, that's a Spanish word. All of the West was their land, and they came and harvested on the land, and now they can't quite as easily. And the farmers, guess who pays most? Because the big farms know how to absorb it. They can set up full-time jobs with benefits for their workers because the labor market is so tight they can pull it off. But the small farmer who counted on the day laborer has a different situation. The kingdom of heaven, as Jesus describes it, is like a farm. These things are not unrelated. So, if the farmers can't find the laborers, who's to do the work? Is it Mary Sue? Is it you? Is it me? But my vision of heaven never included plucking anything or back-breaking work. Now, here's how this makes sense, or how it ties into our time today. Because Jesus says that heaven is not just something that we talk about in the by and by. It's not just a vision for some future time of reclining and grapes, though grapes may be part of it, apparently. What Jesus says is that the kingdom of heaven is here. It is at hand. And that at times we actually get moments in which we glimpse heaven. Now, I happen to need to glimpse heaven every now and then. I need to glimpse heaven when I look at a headline and hear of yet another young person gunned down in the streets. I really need to glimpse heaven when I read yet another headline that talks about the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history, which of course then ignores all the other deadly mass shootings of black and brown people all over history. And yet, here we are, in a time where it feels like we're hopeless and helpless to do anything about people's access to ending life. And yet Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like the vineyard in which all the laborers come and earn the same thing, no matter how much work they put in. And in this sense of God's economy, we see that the things that we tend to reward are not the things that God counts as most important. What matters is showing up, because there are endless fields of vines to tend. And maybe it is that our vine to tend today is the protection of life, the protection of every single life that breathes, from the trees that God has planted to the people whom God breathes life into. Why, oh why, do we cling to our guns more than we cling to life? Why, oh why, does it have to be part of the American spirit that holding an automatic weapon is a constitutional right? Why do you get a right to a weapon in the Constitution before you get the right not to be shot by authorities? Why do you get a right to a weapon before you get a right to drive a car or any of the other lethal things that we do in our lives? Why? I'm not saying I'm taking away anybody's guns, though I might be willing to do it, but it's not my power. What I'm saying is that Christians, people who follow Jesus, people who are asked to toil in the vineyard in this life, in the kingdom of heaven on earth, and in the sweet by and by, are required to toil for life first. And that's not just the life that begins at birth, as some uni-voting people seem to only think about. But it is life that continues through poverty. It's life that continues through wondering where the access to jobs will be. It's life that continues wondering whether or not your child is going to school and having to learn the kind of drill that tells them how to survive if an active shooter shows up. This is what our children have to learn. Do we have parents in here who have children? No, I don't see any of those parents. Yeah, I bet your daughter has had to learn what she's supposed to do when an active shooter comes. They all have instructions. What kind of education is that we have to give in this day? And so I brought up the question of your imagination, because imagination is the place where we start to take over, and we start to be able to see the real work that is in front of us. Because the powers that be and the forces of evil would have you imagine heaven as only a cloud and not a place that is in front of you. The powers that be would have you imagine that there's nothing we can do, that what we know is all there can be. The powers that be, the predators that would love to assault the vineyard and the life that lives inside of it, the parasites that would love to leech on it, would help to have you to think that there is nothing that you can do, when that has never been the case, nor will it ever, so long as we have a God. And so there is always work to do. I hear about that work as I talk to each of you, and the work that God has asked you to toil to do in the vineyard, to help people's health, to bring people new life, to make them stronger, to tend to their finances, to teach the children who are here, the dreamers who did not even choose to cross these borders but are here now and deserve the very, very best, to sing to them and bring them joy, to care for them, I love this story of a vineyard. The woman who joined us here from the very back row, who I met in the coffee shop, was telling me about her work with the Momentum AIDS Project, which is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful vineyard work project that started in the 80s. And I know about it because it was housed for a while at the church I used to serve. And the beautiful thing about the Momentum AIDS Project was that back when we were first learning about AIDS, and it seemed like this scary thing you couldn't touch, what one person in particular and others who joined him thought was what would it be while everyone is calling these, at that point, men untouchable? We invited them into the church, and we spread out the most beautiful feast with white tablecloths and linens, and served them and brought them social services and cared for them and said, your body matters. Even when people want to push you aside, you belong here, right at the table with our very best. And as these men were dying and dying, New York City would not allow them in the cemeteries. They couldn't go and have a normal burial. Instead, they were being shipped off to the potter's field. And through the Momentum AIDS Project, a faith-based project, churches like St. Peter's decided, you know what? We're not going to send people to the potter's field. We're going to build a place where their cremains can remain. And we're not going to set it off at some outside site. We're going to put it right in the middle of our sanctuary. So that always we acknowledge that the people who are being set aside are first in God's eyes. Amen? And this is what it means to toil in the vineyard. Reverend Luis Alfredo, every Saturday, works as part of this important ministry of this church to bring a full feast to people who are suffering from access to food, maybe from homelessness or just from the high cost of living here in the city. This is what we do, is we toil in the vineyard. But sometimes it's more personal. Because at times, when we're wondering if we're toiling in the vineyard, if we're doing the work God has called us to do, we have to realize it also comes in interpersonal relationships, where we have to ask, am I putting God first as I relate to another person? Am I listening to the voice of God to feel a creative spirit within me, or am I forcing my views on others? Am I being gentle instead of aggressive? Am I prepared to admit that I'm wrong? That is what it means to be a laborer in the vineyard. Now, there's no one answer. And the traditional interpretation, of course, of this text is that the vineyard is the mission field and the laborer is the disciple. And that's not a bad interpretation. Because when we are doing the work God has called us to do, then we have a chance to tell everybody about it. Because when you're doing your labor, it's something someone else should probably be doing too. So you start to tell that story and you get excited about it and you start to lift up and your spirit is a little bit more open and you're saying, y'all come. Because there's always room for more. Church sometimes struggles with it, doesn't it? I've been in so many churches that have said, we really, 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 really want people. So let's get them. And then we get them because the people who've been doing the work are a little tired and they're ready for someone else to come. But then as soon as they come, they have ideas. They want to start pruning the vines like this instead of like this. They might want you to speak their language or try to hear it. They might challenge us to be more welcoming than we care to be. And that's specifically what Jesus talks about in this text today. Sometimes the laborers can be the very ones who get in God's way. So the idea, as we figure out what our piece of harvesting what God has put in front of us is, we have to realize there's room for someone else right next to us, and it's our job to put them there. And maybe they'll get more recognition for the work. Maybe nobody's going to pat us on the back the way we thought we would. And if we're doing it right, it doesn't matter. because it's not about us. It's about God. A few of us had a wonderful opportunity the other day to worship for Sukkot Shabbat, right around the corner at Park Avenue Synagogue, which is just up here at 87th and Park. And they had invited us to come and join them to reflect on the violence that we're experiencing. The rabbi who offered the meditation, for the drash as they call it, for that night, said this: Sukkot is the festival of booths, which is when the people will erect something like a tent. And one of the requirements of putting up the tent is that it can't be a permanent structure. It has to be able to be blown down if a strong enough wind will come. And so the roof needs to be as impermanent as possible. If you're not worried about whether or not it's going to fall down, then you're not doing it right. And he said, we do this every year because the spiritual practice of being in a structure and living in a structure that might collapse is essential to our faith. Because every time we believe that what we have around us is permanent, then we start to treat it like an idol. And we count on that more than we count on God. And so we build in the practice from year to year to realize that what matters most to us is not our home, it's not our money, because none of that we can take to the grave. Instead, it's our closeness to God. And I bring this up now because as I bring this home, I want you to know that nothing matters more than your labor in the vineyard. It's not an exclusive space. The people you care about most are welcome there too. All of your love is gathered into this place. The vineyard is a space and a time that is heaven. So Rover's there, but so is everything else that matters. Which means that perhaps to make room for your labor, something else needs to be pushed aside. What would it feel like to have impermanent structures around you as a way to remember that your hope and your power comes from God and not the things that your boss or whoever seems to lord power over your life calls on you to do? For the true employer and the one who gives you in that moment of labor your glimpse of heaven will always be with you, will never abandon you, and will carry you through. In Jesus' name, amen.